Okay, got it. Right. All right, I'm ready to let everyone in if you are.
Yeah, sure.
All right, welcome folks. We're just admitting the last few people here. Got a few more joining us. Okay, that's everyone so far. Hopefully we'll have some more folks join us. Welcome, my name is Lara Villamont. My pronouns are she and her. I am the head of outreach and community experience here at the Framingham Public Library. We are so thrilled that you are able to join us tonight for our lifelong learning program. This is a partnership between the Framingham Public Library and Framingham State University. And we are so thrilled to present tonight Dr. Dan Breen of Brandeis. He will be talking about Watergate 50 years later. A few quick notes before we get started. This is the final lecture of our spring series. The Lifelong Learning series will resume again in the fall, and we're planning at this time to have them take place in person in the Costin Room, fingers crossed, along with a live stream available through YouTube. If you attend our Sunday concerts, it'll be a very similar setup. If you're attending this chat tonight, we have your email, and we will be sure to contact you closer to the date in the fall with more details and updates. For tonight's chat, at the end of the lecture, we will have time for a question and answer period. You can enter your questions into the chat and I will read them out loud to Dr. Breen. Please make sure that when you put your questions in the chat, you select send to everyone, just in case someone has the same question that you do. As I'm sure you've got the little pop-up, tonight's lecture is being recorded for future viewing on the library's YouTube channel. Videos are usually posted within a few days, so if you know someone who was not able to be here for tonight's chat, please send them to our YouTube channel and they will be able to view it in the future. I'll be adding an evaluation form to our chat box for the library. Please feel free to click the link after the lecture has ended to share your thoughts with us. Please do make sure that you wait until the lecture is over because it is going to redirect you to a new page, and we want to make sure that you get everything that Dr. Breen has to offer before you leave us tonight. Let us know what you thought about the lecture tonight, if you have any ideas for future programs, and if you would like to join our mailing list. And of course, because we are the library, we will never use your information for anything other than to tell you about other fabulous programs like tonight. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Breen. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody for tonight's presentation on Watergate. We're about to commemorate, not really celebrate, but commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. So I thought maybe this would be a good time just to go over the events that resulted in the Watergate scandal and its aftermath. And I thought probably we should just begin by the most terrifying moment in any modern instructor's life, and that is sharing screen. So let's hope this goes okay. So far, so good. And we'll begin from the beginning. There's our first slide. And we will continue with what I think is going to be a good way to organize this presentation. I've identified 7 specific episodes in the story of Watergate that, if they had gone a different way, might not have produced the break-in, or even if there had been a break-in, maybe it would not have ended with the resignation of President Nixon in August of 1974. So let's begin the story just with a general comment. Everybody's heard of Watergate. It's probably the most well-known scandal in American history. And it's also given rise, as we know, to a whole different way of referring to scandals that was never true before, this gate or that gate or that gate. Some of those gates are pretty famous. Korea Gate is pretty well known, for example. But there's also Gular Gate, which is a gate that took place in Azerbaijan, a political scandal, very important over there. But my favorite of the gates is probably Gate, which has to do with a politician of the United Kingdom who was very upset because in going to 10 Downing Street to meet with the prime minister, he was made to use a regular pedestrian gate that was open to the general public, not really for VIPs. So there's at least 200 different gates, but Watergate is the very first one. And the story of Watergate with this cast of characters is pretty complicated, I think. And that's why I thought maybe looking at these 7 specific episodes will help us better understand what happened and maybe how things could have gone a bit differently. So let's start with episode number 1. I think the first key event, probably giving rise to Watergate, took place 2 years into Nixon's tenure as president. Remember, he took the oath of office in January, as you see here, of 1969. Now, when Nixon first got to be president, he wanted no reminder at all of the former Democrats who had occupied the Oval Office, especially Kennedy and Johnson. And as a matter of fact, when he arrived in the White House and began to establish his hideaway office at the old Executive Office building, not too far away from the White House, one thing he was really upset about was a lot of the personnel, that is the permanent civil servants, still had pictures of Kennedy and Johnson on their desks. And Nixon ordered all those pictures removed, wanted no reminder of them at all. And one thing he also found out was that Lyndon Johnson had a taping system at the White House, especially in the Oval Office. Well, that was Johnson's taping system, and Nixon ordered it completely expunged. Wanted nothing to do with that at all. And he seems never to have thought of a taping system when he first arrived at the White House, but that began to change about maybe a year and a half into the administration, maybe for several reasons. But one reason that was kind of getting on Nixon's nerves was the fact that his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, whom Nixon tended to refer to as Jew Boy, would act a different way outside the Oval Office than he would within the Oval Office. So while he was talking to Nixon and his advisors, Kissinger could be very hawkish, especially on the Vietnam War, could be very tough, wanting very stern military action. But then after hours, when Kissinger would hit the cocktail circuit and start talking to his old buddies in the Washington establishment, he liked to pose as more of a moderate. And sometimes he would even call Nixon a maniac. And Kissinger would pose as a person holding Nixon back from his worst instincts. And Nixon would get word of this, and he knew a lot of that wasn't quite true. So he needed a way to set the record straight. And what better way than to install a taping system, not just at the White House, but also at the old Executive Office building where his hideaway office was, and also at Camp David. So what happened was in early 1971, February of 1971, I believe, he and Haldeman, H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, decided they would install a taping system. And the taping system was not going to be what we would call advanced. The tapes would look something like this, kind of an early 1970s vintage taping system. And Nixon, of course, knew nothing about tapes. Haldeman didn't know much either. So they decided to deputize Haldeman's assistant, a guy named Alexander Butterfield, to supervise the installation of the taping system at the White House. And there's Colonel Alexander Butterfield for you, a man who'd served in Vietnam, 98 combat missions, in fact, flying over Vietnam, very efficient servant. And he was happy to undertake the duty, did it pretty efficiently. And by the end of February, into the late part of the winter, the taping system was pretty much all installed. And by the way, Alexander Butterfield, back in his UCLA days, was named the person who most looked collegiate, most collegiate looking male. I'm not sure what that means, but I suppose he looked collegiate back then. At any rate, the system started running in the winter of 1971. And all told, that taping system, both at the White House and at the Executive Office building in Camp David, would eventually record 3,500 hours of presidential conversations, a truly priceless historical asset. And also, of course, something that would spell Nixon's doom, as we'll see a little bit later. So that's the first event, the decision to install a taping system at the White House. Nixon didn't know a whole lot about technology, so it isn't as if he was operating it himself, turning it on and turning it off. They just left it on all the time. And Nixon often acted as if he didn't know there were tapes there, probably forgot about it occasionally in conversations. And that's one reason why this was going to be a very good historical source. Well, at any rate, the tapes are ongoing. And that leads us to episode number 2. And episode number 2 that gave rise to Watergate and its aftermath happened a little bit later in 1971. In fact, June 13th, 1971, when the New York Times published the famous Pentagon Papers, revealing, among other things, years and years of official American lies about the Vietnam War. And that's not the sort of thing that really should have bothered Nixon, you would think, because the Pentagon Papers reflected badly on Kennedy, and badly on Johnson, but certainly not on Nixon. All this happened before Nixon took office in 1969. But Nixon was obsessed with the man who had actually leaked the Pentagon Papers by laboriously on an old-fashioned Xerox machine, copying every single one of the 7,000 pages individually that would eventually be published by the New York Times. And that man, of course, was the man on the left. That's Daniel Ellsberg, the Rand employee, Rand Corporation employee, who had actually done this. What Nixon was afraid of was that Ellsberg wasn't just working alone. Nixon was afraid that Ellsberg might be part of some vast left-wing conspiracy that also had contacts in the White House, maybe under Nixon's very nose. He was obsessed with making sure the White House wouldn't leak things of the sort that could compromise him and national security. And he decided that he wanted to make sure that was less likely or as little likely as possible. So this is what he said to H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff. We can't drop this, Bob. You can't let that Jew, Ellsberg, steal that stuff and get away with it. Who at the White House might be leaking information or be in the mood to leak information to Ellsberg or someone else? That's what Nixon wanted to find out. So determined to find this out, he told his aide, Chuck Colson, to make sure no leaks were possible at the White House. And what he said was, I don't want to be told why this can't be done, Nixon said. The government cannot survive. It cannot function if anyone can go out and leak. I don't give a damn how it's done. Just stop the leaks. And so Colson, along with John Ehrlichman, the man you see on the left in this picture, H.R. Haldeman is on the right, put together a team of people who would work through the White House and try to figure out if anybody was actually leaking things to the press. That team would be headquartered, special secret team, at room 16 at the old executive office building. And they would tap phones and they would try to keep track of anybody who might be giving information to the press. And the man who literally put that team together was a guy named Bud Crow. And working with him was a former CIA operative, soon to be famous, named E. Howard Hunt, who also happened to be a spy novelist. And soon signing on to this secret team, working out of room 16 at the old executive office building, was a lawyer named George Gordon Battle Liddy, a man who liked to regale White House secretaries with the story of how it was possible, if you really wanted to kill somebody with a pencil. And Liddy used to describe just how that would be done. Now, Liddy wanted to name this secret group that would try to make sure there weren't any leaks or figure out who was doing it, Odessa. And the reason he wanted to name it Odessa was that was named after a rumored network of former Nazi SS officers still at large somewhere in Europe and South America. But the team soon acquired a different name. One of Bud Crow's comrades in putting the team together was a deputy of Henry Kissinger named David Young. And when David Young's grandmother asked him, what are you doing at the White House? David Young happened to say, well, I'm working to plug leaks. And so David Young's grandmother said, oh, well, you must be a plumber. And so the name stuck. The unit would then be called the Plumbers. And the group soon broke into, pretty famously later, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to see if they could find any dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. They did that, but luckily another plan was squelched, and that was the plan of Liddy to secretly, without him knowing it, lace Ellsberg with LSD so he would say and do things to make a fool of himself. Luckily, that never happened. And another thing that never happened was Nixon's order for this unit, the Plumbers Unit, to break into the liberal Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., to see if anybody there might be working with Ellsberg or somebody also at the White House. And luckily, that never happened because Colson wanted to firebomb the Brookings Institution, maybe to create a diversion so the plumbers could get in ultimately without being noticed. Well, now we have a secret unit plotting and indeed carrying out illegal activities through the old executive office building with Nixon's knowledge and certainly with the active cooperation of Ehrlichman, Colson, and others close to Nixon. Now, there was no doubt that Nixon was a pretty secretive personality who was obsessed with the idea that his political enemies were always out to get him by any means, fair or foul. But what is it that he was so afraid that people would find out? And this has plagued historians for a long time. Why was Nixon so intent on making sure there weren't any leaks at the White House that he would hire somebody like Liddy, this old FBI operative who had all sorts of crazy ideas, who was a bit of a loose cannon? why would Nixon take risks like that? And a leading theory happens to be that Nixon was afraid of one big thing getting out. And that has to do with the closing days of the 1968 campaign, just 3 years before the Plumbers Unit was formed. Johnson, remember, was not running. Hubert Humphrey was running against Nixon in 68. And if you remember the campaign, Humphrey was gaining on Nixon in the last couple of weeks. It was a very exciting campaign indeed. And there was some worry in the Nixon camp that Humphrey would actually overtake him. And it turned out that Lyndon Johnson, in those closing weeks of the campaign, was on the verge of getting North Vietnam to agree to meaningful peace talks in return for a cessation of the bombing by the Americans of North Vietnam. And that would have been a really good thing for Humphrey if word of that had gotten out, that maybe a ceasefire might be at hand. To prevent that, some historians believe that Nixon contacted this woman, that's Claire Chennault in the middle there, sometimes known as Little Flower, and urged her to use her contacts with the South Vietnamese government to have South Vietnam squelch that deal before it could happen. And according to some historians, Nixon urged Chennault to tell the South Vietnamese, if you don't allow this ceasefire to happen, I promise, once I'm elected president, Nixon promised that I would give South Vietnam a better deal. In fact, just the opposite happened. South Vietnam was not treated better by Nixon than they would have gotten under a Johnson deal. But anyway, that's what the promise seems to have been. And it could be that that series of events was just what Nixon wanted to keep quiet, because unpatriotic as that was, mendacious as that was, if that ever got out, that would make Nixon look very bad. Somebody who had prevented a potential ceasefire that might have saved 10,000s of lives because he wanted to win the 1968 campaign. That's at least one theory. We don't know, but he certainly was obsessed with secrecy, and that's the only way to understand the Plumbers Unit. Well, that brings us finally to episode number 3, moving right along in the sequence of major episodes that help explain the break-in and its aftermath. And episode number 3, I would say, was the assignment of G. Gordon Liddy to the Committee to Re-elect the President in 1972. The Committee to Re-elect the President, sometimes called CREEP or CRP as the administration referred to it, was called that because there was a focus group that told the Nixon people that people were more favorably inclined to a committee called the Committee to Re-elect the President than they were to a committee called the Committee to Re-elect Nixon. And so the name stuck, the Committee to Re-elect the President, often called CREEP. So Liddy was assigned to CREEP, and what that meant was that Liddy, the plumber, would be working under White House counsel John Dean, who you see here on the right. And Dean's job would be to funnel campaign money from CREEP into Liddy and some of the other plumbers in order to engage in some cases, espionage activities, as we'll see a little bit later, against Democratic primary candidates and maybe ultimately the nominee as well. So in early 1972, G. Gordon Liddy sat down with John Dean on the right and also Attorney General John Mitchell, Nixon's friend, who you see on the left, who was the Attorney General about to be the full-time head of CREEP in the very near future. And at that meeting, Liddy outlined a series of plans, a series of activities that he proposed to use CREEP campaign money to fund. Altogether, these activities of Liddy's, from Liddy's imagination, were called Gemstone. And one aspect of Gemstone was for Liddy and the Republicans to follow Democratic candidates through the air. The Republicans would have their own jet. That jet would tail Democratic candidates' jets and eavesdrop on what the candidates were saying in the Democratic jets that way through the air. That's one thing Liddy proposed. Another thing he proposed was to kidnap anybody likely to protest at the Republican National Convention, drug them, and then take them to Mexico so they could not be at the convention. That was plan number 2. Another plan Liddy came up with, and this is all going to be with Republican campaign money, remember, was to hire a houseboat and then to have some call girls, prostitutes on the houseboat, and lure Democratic convention goers to the houseboat and embarrass them, maybe even some candidates, if you can go that far, maybe photograph them in compromising positions. So all of this was illegal. Like every single one of these things was illegal, of course, but there's Liddy laying out these plans to Dean and Mitchell. And Dean and Mitchell were both lawyers. They both practiced law. Neither of them seemed to have said, "You're fired." Neither of them said anything about how you can't do any of that. It's all completely beyond the law. All Mitchell did was puff his pipe and listen. And at the end, John Mitchell, who's the Attorney General, did not forbid Liddy to do any of that. He seems to have simply said something like, "That's all too expensive. Go back to the drawing board. You bring us something else." And what Liddy did was precisely that. He decided to go back to the drawing board and began to plan some cheaper operations, which would involve conventional break-ins, like the kind at Ellsberg psychiatrist's office. That could be at maybe candidates' offices like McGovern or Muskie or somebody like that. In those plans for break-ins, which would cost much less money than these other plans like flying a jet overhead, would eventually be known as Operation Opal or just Opal. So later on, now we're in early 1972, later on, now the head of the committee to re-elect the president, that is Creep, Mitchell, who also happened to be a member, a resident of the Watergate in Washington, Mitchell would assure Liddy that he would have about $200,000 to work with for whatever he was planning. And then sometime in April, a little bit later, April of 1972, there was a meeting down at Key Biscayne, which was Nixon's Nixon's getaway in Florida, mostly owned by his friend B.B. Rebozo, where Nixon liked to go relax. It appears that there was a meeting there. Mitchell might have been part of it at one point, but Jim Magruder, Mitchell's deputy at Creep, was certainly at the meeting. And at that meeting, apparently, Magruder suggested that maybe the Watergate Hotel would be a good target for a break-in, because the Watergate was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, and that was where Larry O'Brien, the head of the Democratic National Committee, had his office. Liddy does not seem to have considered the Watergate before this meeting, and nobody really knows what was concluded, but it looks as if Magruder, on behalf of Creep, suggested it, and Liddy then went on and planned it on his own. Now, Magruder and Liddy did not get along very well. And I'll just give you a story to illustrate that. Once, not long after this, they were in an elevator together, and Magruder put his arm around Liddy, and Magruder told Liddy, you've got these expenses, you need to be more careful in justifying them when you submit your reports. Liddy did not like Magruder's arm around him, so Liddy said to Magruder, quote, "If you do not remove your hand from my shoulder, I will rip your arm out of your socket and beat you to death with it." Well, bringing Liddy and Hunt over to Creep was playing with fire. Hunt, remember, the old CIA guy, now working for Colson through the plumbers unit in the White House. These two maybe would have some pretty crazy ideas, especially Liddy, and that was dangerous enough. But just as fateful for Nixon and what would eventually be the Watergate scandal was the decision to involve this man with whatever Liddy was planning, especially in regard to the Watergate Hotel. And that, of course, is James McCord. And James McCord was a former CIA man, just like Hunt was. And James McCord was actually head of security for CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. And he was a very well-liked person. Seemed to know his way around recording instruments very well, which is one reason Liddy wanted him involved. But the problem with having McCord involved with whatever Liddy was planning on doing was that, unlike Liddy, unlike Hunt, McCord was not a plumber. McCord worked directly for CREEP. And not only that, he had a very high position at CREEP, head of security. So the problem with this was, if anything went wrong in any future break-in, and these people were captured, arrested, well, arresting James McCord automatically would tie whatever happened to the Committee to Re-elect the President, because he has such a high supervisory role there. So this was playing with fire, having McCord involved. Maybe Liddy and Hunt would just say it's a rogue operation, nobody authorized us to do this. But how could they say that if McCord was involved? That would make it a little bit more difficult. But he was so experienced that he was signed on. And by the spring of 1972, he was involved with planning the break-in at the Watergate. And he was even the man who sort of cased the joint, walking through the area where the Democratic headquarters were in the light of day, in broad daylight, claiming to be the uncle of somebody who worked there who just wanted to look around. And having looked around, casing the joint a little bit, they finally decided to go forward with the plan. And that, of course, in the spring of 1972, sets the stage for episode number 4, which is the actual break-in. So far we have a plumber's unit that have been operating in the White House, transferred over to Creep at the beginning of 1972. And many of those plumbers, now joined by James McCord, were now going to plan this operation to see what they could find in the Democratic National Committee headquarters. That's the Watergate there. That complex was built in 1965, Watergate Hotel, and also a place for people to live. For example, as I said earlier, Mitchell and his wife, Martha Mitchell, lived there. A lot of people didn't like the Watergate. It doesn't look like a lot of buildings in Washington, as you can see. And an early architectural critic actually said that building the Watergate in Washington, D.C. was like hiring a stripper to go to your grandmother's funeral because it was so different from everything else. But it was a pretty prestigious address as it remains today, and that's where the Democratic National Headquarters was. Now, to this day, nobody knows for sure what the plumbers expected to find at the Watergate, in Larry O'Brien's office, and in the DNC headquarters in general. Were they looking for something that maybe the Democrats had on Nixon, or were they looking for something that they could use against the Democrats? Liddy always claimed that they were looking for something that maybe the Democrats had on Nixon here near the height of the 1972 presidential campaign. Well, we'll never actually know. All we know is that in May, there was an initial break-in. They put some bugs on Larry O'Brien's phone so they could listen in on what was going on. Those bugs didn't work very well. John Mitchell, the head of Creep, who we don't think authorized the break-in, but at least now knew about it, heard some of those conversations, was disappointed in the sound quality. You could barely hear anything. And so that meant the plumbers were going to go back in. Liddy decided not to leave it there, but to go in and do a better job. And the night they would do it would be June 17th, 1972. And so on that night, Liddy and Hunt, who had been working together for a while now on the plumbers, were at a command post that they'd set up at the Howard Johnson's across the street from the Watergate, while inside, McCord and 4 burglars, known ever after as the Cubans, would penetrate the DNC headquarters. This is all after hours, photograph documents, and put some bugs on the phone. By the way, McCord's associates are always called the Cubans, but one of them was not technically a Cuban. That was Frank Sturgis. Frank Sturgis spent a lot of time in Cuba, though, because he helped train Castro's guerrillas in the late 1950s. And then he switched sides and tried to cooperate in a plan to assassinate Castro by concealing poison pills in the face cream of the woman who was then going out with Castro. The more you get into Watergate, the more these stories pile up. At any rate, Frank Sturgis was there on June 17th, along with the 3 Cubans and McCord. And they, as they went in from the garage, they wanted to make sure they could get in and out from the garage to the basement. So as many maintenance workers would do, they put a tape on the door so that the thing wouldn't lock behind them if they had to go out. And then they went up and they saw what they could do at the Watergate. So McCord puts the tape on the door from the garage to the basement. Now, he didn't think anybody would care about that. Maintenance workers did that all the time. But then a little bit later, security guard at the Watergate, a guy named Frank Wills, who made $80 a week as a security guard at the Watergate, he noticed the tape and he did his job. He took the tape off. He figured a maintenance worker had probably forgotten it and he thought nothing of it, and he went out to have a bite to eat. Then McCord and Hunt, who are going back and forth, they come back and they see the tape is not on the door. That is, McCord came back. McCord came back and he saw the tape was not on the door. And he radioed Hunt, who was with Liddy across the street at the Howard Johnson's. And McCord said that the tape's not on the door. Now, at this point, Hunt gave some good advice. Hunt said, we got to stop the mission. Somebody might be on to us. Somebody noticed the door was there. Get your people down here. Let's just forget the whole thing. And as some of you know, in my spare time, I'm a criminal mastermind. And that's exactly what I would do. If somebody knew the tape was on the door, I would probably just forget the whole thing. I'm going to go home. But Hunt, who had good advice, wasn't listened to here. Liddy and McCord wanted to go through with it. And so McCord put another piece of tape on the door, went back upstairs, And Frank Wills found that second tape. And when the security guard found the second tape, that clued him into the fact that something was going on. There's got to be a burglary going on. And he did the right thing again. Now, Frank Wills got a 40-cent a week raise for doing the right thing. But what he did was he changed history. He called the DC police. And the DC police showed up. They've just been told there's a probable burglary. And the funny thing about all this is that when the DC police showed up, McCord and the Cubans were still upstairs. These were undercover cops. And they pulled up in a car that wasn't a police car. So Liddy's lookouts see these guys pull up. They don't look like cops. And so McCord and the Cubans were not notified in time that you better get out while you can because there are police on the way up. The first thing they knew, the police are coming in to the Democratic National Headquarters and they're saying, hands up, hands up. In other words, they've been caught. And that was Saturday, June 17th. McCord and the Cubans were under arrest. By Monday, investigators searching the hotel room where the burglars were staying found address books that they owned with E. Howard Hunt's name in the address books, along with a notation WH for White House by the names. Very curious thing, of course, if you're investigators. Now the burglars have been linked to Hunt, who apparently has something to do with the White House. And the investigators, in the initial probing, just a couple of days after the break-in, also found $100 bills in the hotel and all sorts of recording equipment. And most important of all, they figured out that McCord worked for Creep, which wasn't a very difficult thing for them to do. Now, that was Monday. Also on that Monday, 2 days after the break-in, Liddy, who would soon be arrested, he went to see John Dean. And Liddy said, I am willing to die. I am willing to die if you think that will be best for the cause. And Liddy even told John Dean, I will tell you the street corner I'll be standing on if you want to send somebody by to kill me, just to make sure that I don't talk. I will understand. That's Liddy, the kind of crazy good soldier. But Dean told Liddy, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that, but don't go that far. But Dean also said to Liddy that he, on behalf of Creep and the White House, would make sure that the burglars' legal fees were paid. And they would also make sure enough money was paid to the burglars to ensure they kept silent. That is, they would be taken care of, which I think might have been Dean's exact words. I'm not sure. Things were now moving quickly. Later that week, the FBI had begun to trace money in the burglars' possession back to Creep. And obviously, as Dean knew, and anybody at the White House would know, the more the FBI looked into this, the more they would find out that Hunt had associations not just with the White House, but maybe with the plumbers unit, which had been operating illegally ever since 1971. And that, in the middle of the campaign, would make the White House look awful bad. How to make sure that none of this was exposed? You had a burglary. How do you keep it a burglary without the FBI getting involved and finding out what everybody else had been up to ever since the middle of 1971? And that sets the stage for the meeting that took place on June 23rd, 1972, at the Oval Office. So it's 10 a.m. in the morning, 10 a.m., June 23rd. At that meeting, H.R. Haldeman, Chief of Staff, suggested to Nixon that maybe the thing to do to stop this in its tracks, not embarrass the administration with everything the plumbers have been up to, depending how close the FBI can look into this, maybe the thing to do was to call up the CIA and get the CIA to call off the FBI, painting this as a matter of national security that the FBI should not be involved with. Nixon agreed, thus authorizing what became known as the cover-up. So the cover-up, which began probably with Liddy's discussions with Dean, was now something the President of the United States had authorized. The CIA would call off the FBI and halt the major investigation. And that was obstruction of justice. Right there, as we would see on tape, the famous smoking gun of June 23rd, 1972. They have to be paid, Nixon said at a later meeting. That's all there is to that. The burglars would be prosecuted. They would do their time, like Liddy, like good soldiers. They would accept the money. And in the meantime, since this was a national news story, somebody might have to take the fall. That guy would be John Mitchell, who would resign from his place as head of the committee to re-elect the president. former Attorney General, now former head of CREEP. Mitchell probably did not know ahead of time what Liddy was planning to do, but he would be the one to take the fall. And he certainly knew who Liddy was, where the money was coming from, and what kind of things Liddy had in mind. So that was when Mitchell resigned. That was the same week, just a little bit later after the Watergate break-in. And about the same time, there occurred one of the strangest episodes of the entire Watergate affair. About the same time all this was going on, Martha Mitchell, John Mitchell's wife, who knew James McCord, knew him pretty well, had called Helen Thomas from where she was staying, some say against her will, in California. Helen Thomas was a UPI reporter, really famous UPI reporter. And Martha Mitchell wanted to tell Helen Thomas that she thought, or had reason to think, that John Mitchell and CREEP were up to something more than they were letting on. That's why she called Helen Thomas. But as soon as she got on the phone with Helen Thomas, her minder, so to speak, her bodyguard, a guy who used to work for the FBI named Steve King, seems to have pulled the phone off the wall so that Martha Mitchell could not talk to Helen Thomas. The last thing Helen Thomas heard on the phone was Martha Mitchell saying, "You get away, you get away." And then the phone went dead. A little bit later, according to Martha Mitchell's story, a doctor was called in to sedate her. So she couldn't tell her story the way she wanted to Helen Thomas. And the man, Steve King, who pulled the phone out of the wall, the former FBI guy, is now Steve King, US ambassador to the Czech Republic. No, I don't think he is now, but he was under the Trump administration. And there he is, the way he looked much more recently. Well, it may well be that Nixon's decision to authorize the cover-up with the smoking gun, as it was called, that tape on June 23rd, maybe that wouldn't have amounted to much. I mean, he was riding high in the polls that summer. Watergate was a national story, but so far nobody had tied anything to him after all. It didn't look like it would affect him very much. Nobody knew what he had said to Haldeman on June 23rd in the Oval Office. Prosecutors from the Justice Department would dutifully go after the burglars, but they did not seem too inclined to look into the background of anything that happened, because remember, the FBI knew to keep hands off. They've been told that by the CIA. The Washington Post, through its soon-to-be famous reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, kept getting closer and closer to the sources of the funds that the burglars had in their possession through CREEP. In effect, they were able to establish that there was a lot of money from CREEP being funneled to dirty tricks and other activities. But the White House depicted all that as rogue activities. The White House nothing to do with it. Maybe even the higher ups at CREEP didn't know about it. So as effective as that reporting was, it wasn't really affecting Nixon's standing in the polls, not in the summer and fall of 1972. John Dean was orchestrating the cover-up, making sure the burglars were paid and knew they would be paid for keeping silent. And as long as that was successful, maybe nothing would have ever been a big deal out of this. Nixon praised Dean for his habit of, whenever there was a threatened disclosure, putting his finger in the dike, making sure that whoever had to be paid was paid. There was plenty of committee to reelect the president funds to pay these people. That didn't seem like that was going to be much of a problem. And as we all know, Nixon won a great landslide victory in November of 1972. The burglars would go on trial in early 1973. The idea was they'd keep their mouth shut, they'd take their hush money, they'd accept their sentences, and maybe the whole thing would go away. The only thing that really bothered Nixon and Haldeman and the rest of them was the fact that this Washington Post reporting seemed to be pretty good. And they did seem to be tying CREEP to whatever was going on pretty effectively, at least in terms of the money. What else did the Washington Post know, Nixon wondered, and especially where was the information coming from? Where were Woodward and Bernstein getting all this information? And there was a conversation at the White House, caught on tape, of course, where Haldeman and Nixon talked about this. Where are they getting this information? It's really good information. And Haldeman suggested that maybe the source, Deep Throat, as it was depicted in All the President's Men, maybe the source was actually Mark Felt, the #2 guy at the FBI. And Haldeman was right about that. Mark Felt was the source. Mark Felt was upset about being passed up for the #1 man at FBI. He'd been #2 for a while, and he was the source of a lot of this information. So Nixon thought, maybe you're right, maybe it's Mark Felt. And Nixon said to Haldeman, maybe we buy off Mark Felt. What if we named Mark Felt head of the FBI? That's what he wants. We'll give him that, and he'll stop being a leak. And Haldeman said to Nixon, well, I think Mark Felt might be Jewish, to which Nixon responded, Christ, I'm not going to put another Jew in there. Well, Mark Felt certainly is a Jewish name. And that was it. The plan came to nothing. But as long as everybody kept silent, who knows, maybe those leaks would not make a difference. That's Mark Felt, by the way he looked a little bit after Watergate. Nixon was riding high. It's late 1972, it's early 1973. His approval rating in early 73 was 67%. 67% after this landslide victory. US troops were finally leaving Vietnam. The POWs were coming home. And on the eve of his second inauguration in January of 1973, Nixon, fortified by a few glasses of scotch, was delightedly making plans with Chuck Colson to get at his enemies at last, once he settled into a second term, including the Washington Post. What could go wrong? Well, what did make a difference were two incidents, which I've summarized, episodes 5 and 5A, which occurred in March of 1973. So to backtrack a little bit, in January, the 7 Watergate burglars, Liddy, McCord, Sturgis, in the 3 Cubans, had finally gone on trial. This is US District Court in DC. Right away, 4 of them pled guilty, the 3 Cubans in Sturgis, leaving only Liddy and McCord in the case. Hunt pled guilty as well. The presiding judge, Hunt pleads guilty, and the Sturgis pleads guilty, and the Cubans plead guilty. The ones who didn't plead guilty were McCord and Liddy. Now, the presiding judge was John Sirica. This is John Sirica right here, known as Maximum John for the stiff sentences he liked to give out. Those of you who ever been before a judge in some sort of criminal trial, it's not a good sign when the judge is nicknamed Maximum John, but that's what Sirica's nickname was. Now, he was the son of Italian immigrants, and he graduated from law school all the way back in 1926. So he'd been back this a while. He'd been at this a while. Now, Sirica was nobody's fool. Sirica was a very experienced guy. And when Liddy and McCord went on trial, Sirica noticed that the prosecutors didn't seem to be going after them very hard. And he noticed that the prosecutors didn't seem to want to get into the background of why there was so much money involved here and what the point of all this was from the standpoint of creep. They were just concentrating on the events of the burglary that night at the Watergate and very little else. Sirica strongly suspected that there was a lot more to this story than what was appearing at the trial of Liddy and McCord. The prosecution was bringing in witnesses from creep, including Magruder, the number 2 guy from Mitchell. And Sirica had a very strong feeling that those guys were lying, especially Magruder. But what could he do? As a judge, all he could do was intensely question them. And usually that's a lawyer's role. But Sirica kept interjecting. He asked dozens and dozens and dozens of questions of these witnesses, trying himself to get to the bottom of what all this was about. And the witnesses just kept stonewalling him. And he just knew there was more to the story. Why, for example, Sirica asked creep treasurer Hugh Sloan, did G. Gordon Liddy have access to over $200,000? Why would somebody like that have that kind of money available to him? I have no idea, said Hugh Sloan. Sirica felt stymied about all this. The prosecutors just didn't seem to be very energetic. And the defense attorneys didn't seem to be very energetic either. Everybody just seemed to be acting like the fix was in. Now, Sirica was determined to give these people the biggest sentences he could. But what he really wanted to do was get to the bottom of this. What's actually going on? The jury found Liddy and McCord guilty of conspiracy and burglary. Neither of them had said anything at all. And all Sirica could do, apparently, was refuse to let them out on bail pending sentencing. And he was going to give them the biggest sentence he could. But something really nagged at him. Was there any possible way to figure out what was actually going on here? Now, as the sentencing date approached, which would be March 23rd, as that date approached, John Dean was having some restless nights. The burglars who were about to be sentenced were asking for more money, including Hunt. In a meeting at the White House, 2 days before the sentencing, now this was March 21st, Dean informed Nixon that Hunt now wanted over $100,000 to keep silent. The money was growing, as sometimes happens when you pay people hush money, they keep wanting more. John Dean famously said that there was a cancer growing on the presidency. So much money was being paid to these people, and that it might take over $1 million over 2 years to keep everybody silent. To this, Nixon responded, "We could get that. Over $1 million. We could get that." This was somewhat to Dean's surprise. Nixon went on to say, "I know where it could be gotten." And once more, the President of the United States had effectively broken the law. He's not just authorizing the cover-up, he's authorizing more hush money, obstructing justice to that extent. He repeated, Nixon did, that they could get the money, and told Dean to go sit down with John Mitchell out of government at the Watergate to see if Mitchell could arrange a way to get the money to the burglars who needed more of it. So that's March 21st. And then the Great Bombshell, March 23rd, the day of the sentencing. Liddy was all set to go to jail. He wasn't going to say anything. He's going to get a 20-year sentence, which was the biggest thing Sirica could levy on him. McCord was different. McCord had not been a plumber. McCord thought that in helping Liddy on behalf of John Mitchell, who had been Attorney General, remember, there must have been some good reason for all of them to be bugging the phones and photographing documents. McCord was not conscious of having done much wrong. McCord honestly thought that he did not deserve the probable 20-year sentence he was about to get from Judge Sirica. Here he was, James McCord, a patriot, a straight-laced former CIA man, now being kept in a filthy, insect-ridden cell at the DC prison, watching men like Jeb Magruder literally perjure themselves by saying they knew nothing about any of this when McCord knew full well that they did. Why should Magruder go home and McCord go to jail? That's what he was wondering. Why should he take the fall? So what McCord did was he wrote a letter to Judge Sirica, probably the most important thing of the whole story. And in that letter, what McCord said was that he and other defendants were under pressure from above not to talk. He said that people during the trial had committed perjury. Sirica took that letter, read it in open court, and now Watergate, which had been a bit on the back burner, was now exploding into national news again. McCord went on to say that Magruder, Mitchell's deputy at CREEP, knew about Opal, that is the plans for break-ins at, not maybe just at the headquarters, but at Democrat candidates' headquarters. That's what McCord said. And McCord also said a little bit later that John Dean, on behalf of the White House, was the man handling the cover-up. All of this was known now, not just to Sirica and the press, but also to the Senate committee investigating Watergate, famously headed by Sam Ervin. And they began looking into these allegations, hush money payments from the White House through John Dean, and so did Sirica. And what was once a minor story, a third-rate burglary, as Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, had famously called it, was now looking like a major series of charges of obstruction of justice, maybe stemming from the White House itself. John Dean, the bagman, as some people call him, clearly guilty of numerous counts of obstruction of justice, was ready to come clean now to the grand jury after these allegations. And so on April 22nd, Nixon spoke to Dean for the last time. On April 30th, Nixon fired Dean. Both Haldeman and Ehrlichman resigned. And in public, Nixon told the American people, if any of this happened, it happened because back in 1972, back in the summer, I was so intent on shepherding the United States through difficult international waters and being the best president I could, that I overlooked anything that my selfish campaign for president might have been doing. That was really the opposite of the truth, but that's what Nixon said in public. In private, when FBI agents arrived at the White House to supervise the cleaning out of Haldeman and Ehrlichman's offices at the White House, Nixon was so upset that he grabbed one FBI agent, threw him in a chair, and said, "I don't want you in my way." Well, events were now, from Nixon's point of view, beginning to spin out of control. There was a grand jury looking into the cover-up, allegations of hush money. There was a Senate special committee led by Ervin looking into the same thing. Judge Sirica was very curious about this. And in addition, there was now a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, looking into the cover-up. Cox was a Harvard Law School professor who was hired by the new Attorney General, Elliot Richardson. And Cox took this job out of the old-fashioned belief that maybe somebody had to try to restore trust in US political institutions, as that trust was beginning to be severely degraded here in the spring of 1973. But really, when they got right down to it, as of then, what was this really all about? Dean is saying one thing, Nixon authorized him to pay the hush money. Nixon's saying something else. I didn't know about this. Maybe my aides did, but not me. It's Dean's word against Nixon. And as long as it's Dean's word against Nixon, maybe there's no impeachment here. Maybe this thing eventually blows over. Maybe it's not going to make Nixon look great, but maybe this is something he could survive. That April, when Dean, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman were all gone from the White House, that April, 25% of the American people, and only 25% of the American people, thought that Nixon should face impeachment. After all, it's his word against Dean's. Wouldn't you err on the side of believing the president? But of course, there was a way to tell who was telling the truth. It wouldn't just be Nixon versus Dean or Nixon versus others. And that leads us to incident number 6. On July 13th, just a few weeks after John Dean gave bombshell testimony before the Irvin Committee, testimony that some of you may remember watching back in the late spring, early summer of 1973, Alexander Butterfield was called before investigators working for the Irvin Committee. Butterfield had done a great job as Haldeman's deputy, and on the basis of that work, he had been given a much better job. Actually, Butterfield's dream job, head of the Federal Aviation Administration in Washington. After all, he was a combat pilot. He loved the job. But that July, he was called in because, after all, the committee's looking into anything they could find out about in regard to White House conversations. And they had a few questions about the setup at the White House. Now, nobody knew anything about any tapes on the committee, but they wanted to talk to Butterfield about his job when he was the deputy of Haldeman. And Butterfield told his wife before he went to testify that they're not going to ask me about the tapes. I really doubt they're going to ask me about the tapes. Now, nobody really knew about this little interview. It was out of the public eye. It was in an office at the old executive office building. Butterfield sat down. He's got a couple investigators in front of him. The investigators just took him through some routine questions. What did you do? What was the appointment book like? What was the layout at the Oval Office? That kind of thing. But one thing the investigators knew from talking to other witnesses was that Nixon had this habit of sometimes he'd be talking to you, maybe at the old executive office building, maybe at the Oval Office, and then he'd ask you to shift position from here over to there. Well, why would Nixon do that? And they asked Butterfield, do you know why Nixon would do that? And that's when Butterfield told the investigators, I was afraid you fellows would ask me that. I was hoping you fellows would not ask me that. And at that point, Butterfield proceeded to give the probable explanation for the strange habit of Nixon. Butterfield said there were taping devices, not just at the White House, but also in other places where Nixon would go. He disclosed the entire thing. And a couple of days later, he disclosed it before the full committee in public. And that was electrifying news, so much so that Butterfield would now be a household name for the first time in his life. Dean heard about this. He didn't know about a taping system. Dean heard about this and he breathed a sigh of relief. Dean said to himself, I'm no longer the sole accuser, because now there was a way to find out and verify who was telling the truth. Dean surely was not the sole accuser now, because from that moment on and for the next year, the real accuser would be the tapes. And the entire question was, who would be able to listen to those tapes? Watergate was now really about the tapes. Irvin wanted the tapes for the Senate committee. Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, he wants the tapes. The grand jury wants the tapes. Sirica wants the tapes. They all want to get their hands on them. If Nixon had helped direct the cover-up, the tapes would show that, presumably. And Nixon had to know that too. He had in fact talked to Haldeman not long before, back I think during the spring. And during the spring, before Butterfield's disclosure, Nixon and Haldeman had talked about destroying the tapes. Maybe we should just get rid of these. But they never did it. And now it was too late. Everybody knew about the tapes and everybody wanted them. And you see how this changes the dynamic of Watergate completely, because it's not just Nixon and Dean anymore. Some people believe Nixon. Now what it's about is a completely new ingredient. The next question everybody's going to ask is, what is Nixon afraid of disclosing? What is Nixon hiding? Why won't he just surrender the tapes? And the more that goes on, the worse Nixon is probably going to look. And that leads us finally to the last of our episodes, episode number 7. Nixon's legal argument for hanging on to those tapes was not terribly strong, but he would make that argument as long as he could. Maybe he could wiggle through this somehow. Maybe there was a way he could satisfy everybody who wants the tapes without actually giving them up. And that's what he was thinking about in October of 1973. As they were pondering this question, how can we avoid disclosing what was on the tapes? In early October of 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew, as you can see here, resigned, having pled guilty to tax evasion charges. And then, in one of the most momentous months in American history, that October 1973, forces from Egypt and Syria launched a surprise invasion of Israel in what became known as the Yom Kippur War. Before the eyes of an anxious world, Israel's very existence seemed to be at stake. And after a slow start, Nixon responded with an unprecedented airlift of supplies, much more than the Berlin airlift, 1,000 tons a day by the middle of October. And in addition to that, over 100 fighter jets were flown to Israel. American pilots would get out of the fighter jets. Israeli pilots would get right in, they take off, and they go right into combat. The tide of the war was turned in dramatic fashion. And in the midst of it all, Nixon's lawyers suggested to Archibald Cox a compromise in regard to the tapes. We're not going to turn over the tapes, neither to Irvin nor to the special prosecutor, that is Archibald Cox. But to make things fair, here's what we'll do. We'll provide transcripts of the tapes you've requested. And remember, nobody requested all the tapes. They requested tapes of conversations they were interested in. And Nixon said, I will provide transcripts, not the tapes themselves. But just to make sure everything's okay, my friend John Stennis, senator, old acquaintance of Nixon, will listen to the tapes. And he will verify that what's on the tapes matches up to the written transcripts that I'm prepared to surrender. That became known as the Stennis Compromise. Would Archibald Cox accept that compromise? Well, probably no prosecutor would accept a compromise like that. And Archibald Cox had every reason not to accept it. Stennis was Nixon's friend, for one thing, and Stennis was famously hard of hearing, for another. How would anybody know that what Stennis was hearing was everything that should be on the transcripts? So Archibald Cox refused this compromise. And that persuaded Nixon to get rid of the special prosecutor. And what he did famously on October 21st, Saturday, October 21st, was he instructed Massachusetts' own Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, to fire Archibald Cox for not accepting the Stennis compromise. And this Richardson simply could not do. He had promised Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, to stand by him. Shortly before all this, knowing what was about to happen, Elliot Richardson had put the question to himself: do I protect the country or do I protect my job? And Richardson decided to protect the country. And he told Nixon, I will not fire Archibald Cox. And instead, rather than do so, he resigned. Whereupon the number 2 man, William Ruckelshaus, got on the phone with Al Haig, the new chief of staff for President Nixon. Haig ordered Ruckelshaus, now the acting attorney general, to fire Archibald Cox. Ruckelshaus, like Richardson, also a Republican, refused to do so. Ruckelshaus believed Nixon had probably broken the law with Watergate. He certainly was not going to fire Archibald Cox. And he said, I will resign rather than do so. And although things are a bit murky in this regard, I think it appears that Haig fired him, wouldn't even let Ruckelshaus resign. And that meant that we go to the number 3 man at the Justice Department, would eventually become much more famous. There he is, Robert Bork. Robert Bork had no compunction at all of thinking that the president had the power to get rid of anybody the president wanted to. And it was Robert Bork who would eventually fire Archibald Cox. And that would be the famous Saturday Night Massacre of October 1973. Nixon thought this might make him look pretty strong and decisive, But to much of the American people, it made him look erratic. It made him look arbitrary. It made him look like he was afraid of the truth coming out. And he seemed to be, among many people, so unbalanced that during the height of the crisis in the Yom Kippur War, while all this was going on, Henry Kissinger and the Joint Chiefs of Staff put the US military on DEFCON 3, high alert, as the Soviet Union was threatening to send an army of 50,000 men to Egypt to make sure the Israeli army could not go any further towards the Suez Canal. In this moment of crisis, Kissinger made that decision and didn't even tell Nixon. That's how bad things were. And in fact, the Saturday Night Massacre was terrible for Nixon, and it made a lot of people begin to lose confidence in him. And I think it was at this point that his unpopularity began to quicken as far as the pace of that among the American people, so that everything Nixon tried to do to salvage the situation, for example, eventually agreeing to give up these transcripts, was not enough to make people believe that he was not involved. The fact that he would not surrender the tapes simply looked to most people like he had something to hide, and his erratic behavior in the Saturday Night Massacre really began to make more and more people lose confidence in him. And that might have been the point of no return. So that all we need to do now is fast forward ultimately to the decision to uphold the lower courts in ordering Nixon to surrender the tapes. That was done by the US Supreme Court in July of 1974. And it was after that that Nixon, knowing what was on those tapes, decided he had no choice but to resign to avoid a probable impeachment. He had talked to Republican senators. Many Republican senators were ready to vote for impeachment, believing that the law was more important than their own guy in the White House. And as a consequence, the Watergate affair came to an end, for our purposes, with Nixon's resignation on August 8th, 1974. And that, or those, are the 7 episodes that I think are crucial in the Watergate affair. It seems to me that if any of them had went the wrong way or a different way, for example, McCord never working for the plumbers creep at the time of the break-in, then the story could have been very different. And it seems to me that if there's a moral here, the moral is that institutions don't work as machines. The only thing that makes institutions work is people who care about them and care about the rule of law. So as long as you got people like Judge Sirica and Archibald Cox, things will go reasonably well. People will try to get away with stuff, but the system will go on and the system will, in general, flourish. But if you don't have people who believe in institutions and just believe in selfish greed and ambition, then no institution, no rule, no law is going to save you. And that's one of the ultimate lessons, I think, of Watergate. So now I think I'll stop share because we're done with my portion. And it looks like we're actually just about done with tonight's presentation because it's after 8 o'clock. But if anybody maybe has a couple questions I could respond to, maybe this would be a good time to do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Breen. So we'd like to invite you at this point to post any questions you have in the chat. I will read them out loud. I'd love to start with one of my own. So this probably speaks more to my high school education than it does to, anyway, I've heard of course, of, Nixon was naughty. Then he resigned. Later on, I learned about the Saturday Night Massacre. I had no idea. I'm kind of blown away by all of the other details. How much of that was known at the time? Is this all kind of trickling in afterwards, or was the whole population of the US kind of following this closely as the court case unfolded?
A lot of it trickled in later as historians were able to look at the tapes and hear the tapes. So some of what I said was not known in 1972 or 73 or 74. But as far as the crucial things about this story, what McCord said in open court, for example, the really important stuff was known pretty quickly.
Sure. I guess I'm just thinking about like planes following other planes and kidnapping, drugging, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, that stuff came out later because that was something Magruder was talking about at the time of the affair, Liddy's Operation Gemstone. That came out with more people talking over time as historians looked into all this. And by the way, if you want to stay at the place at the Watergate where the DNC headquarters was, you can actually stay in that room. It'll cost you $2,500, but you can stay if you want to at that room.
Judy says, thank you for the very interesting retrospective. Question for you. As you were speaking about the recording and, Nixon's happened and all of that, I know there have been 7 administrations. even now actually talking about current recordings and how they impact modern politics. Are there some lessons to be learned here about recording? Is that something that regularly happens in political circles, or does it depend on the administration? Or
No, it doesn't regularly happen. It depends upon the administration. And I think these days, it's more likely that there'll be a law in place that says that if you're recording something, you have to tell people that you're actually recording them. So that's a state law in many places. I'm not sure what federal law says about this. Some of you might know better than me, but there's a lot more, after all this, attention to the possibility of being secretly recorded. And it's easier to sue people and it's easier to prosecute people for doing that than it was back then in the early 1970s.
Let's see, we've got a question in the chat. Philomena says, you said many think that what Nixon was hiding was his secret Vietnam negotiations during the 1968 campaign.
Some people think that.
Is there a consensus about that now, or what are these other things that scholars wonder about?
I wouldn't say there's a consensus. I think there's a consensus that that is likely, but there's also a consensus that it can't be proven. There doesn't seem to be any way to prove it. There were discussions here and there, and some very interesting allusions that Haldeman made to that worry all the way back in 1968. But that was Haldeman. It's not ironclad proof. So we would like to know a lot more about that. That's just a leading theory. There could have been other things that the Nixon was worried about. One thing that he was worried about were some questionable contributions by Howard Hughes, the famous reclusive billionaire, that were made as loans to Nixon's brother. Not all of that was known at the time. There were some questionable aspects of that loan, but who knows? There could have been other things that we'll never know.
While you were speaking, I just did a quick Google, and DC is still a one-party consent recording state, not a two-party.
Oh, not a two-party. Oh, okay. Oh, good for you. That was quick.
Fast fingers.
Yeah.
We've got Norma. Have you seen any of the new show Gaslit? And do you think it is historically accurate?
No, I have not seen that. Something Gaslit?
Yeah, that's the name of the show, is Gaslit. And what she wondered if you thought it was accurate.
I wish I could, but I haven't seen that yet. But I will now.
Donna wonders, when did the famous gap in the tapes come into the story?
Oh, yeah. So the famous 18.5-minute gap was something that the various committees wanting the tapes were really interested in. That took place the same week after the break-in that the smoking gun conversation took place. And the story, of course, was that when Rosemary Wood was beginning to transcribe the tapes into printed form, that she somehow erased the 18.5 minutes. Rosemary Wood's Nixon's secretary apparently didn't know about the tapes until everybody else knew about the tapes. Right? Most people were in the dark, Haldeman, Butterfield, Nixon, just a couple others. But she was given that job. And the question then is, did she do it on purpose on Nixon's instructions, or was it really an accident? And the reason some people think she probably did it on purpose is that when she tried to act out again the sequence of events that represented her mistake in erasing the 18.5 minutes, what she did was really unconvincing. It didn't seem as if that could have been a mistake that somebody would make, or that it could have happened that way. So there was some reason to think it was intentional. But again, that's something we'll never exactly know. What I do know is that the National Archives have really tried hard to use the best of modern contraptions to actually find out what the 18.5-minute gap was. If there's any possible way to find out what that tape said, everybody wants to know. But the most recent thing I read was those efforts have been completely unavailing. And I think the National Archives now thinks we'll never be able to get to the bottom of it. It's just gone.
Are there any speculations as to what it might contain?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it could have. It could have probably had something to do with what Nixon was really afraid of at the FBI. It could have had maybe something more to do about why he was so intent that nothing about the plumbers would ever be raised. There could have been other things like that, but the context doesn't seem to give us a really good idea about what specifically might have been on the tape. But there's just all sorts of possibilities. I think maybe some historians who studied Watergate much more closely than I have would have better ideas specifically about what might have been on there. But it was at a very sensitive time. This was right after the break-in. So it would have been really interesting to see what they talked about then.
Philomena says, Julia Roberts plays Margaret Mitchell in Gaslit. It just came out.
Oh, really? Oh. Yeah, poor Martha Mitchell. that's a sad story.
Okay, well, that's all of the questions we have in the chat. I know we're just a bit beyond our time this evening. So one more question for you, Dr. Breen. What is it you would like us to take away from your chat tonight? The one thing you want us to remember?
The thing I hope that you remember is the kind of thing I'd like to tell my students, and that there really are such people as heroes, people who do the right thing when it's not easy to do the right thing. And those are the people we should celebrate and build statues of. So I think that the takeaway here is that there are people like Sirica and Elliot Richardson in public life, and they should be celebrated maybe more than they are, because everything depends upon them. You do the right thing no matter what. It might mean you lose a salary. It might mean your friends don't talk to you much anymore. But if you do the right thing, then really valuable institutions can be preserved. The best kind of government there is democracy, but it depends upon people caring enough about it to do the right thing.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here with us this evening. I have posted in the chat the link to our evaluation form if you'd like to share with us what you thought about tonight. Thank you, Dr. Breen, for sharing your scholarship with us. And, I definitely learned a huge amount tonight, way more than I did, obviously, in my high school civics class. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is our final lecture of the Lifelong Learning Spring Series. If you weren't here at the beginning, we are planning at this time to be back in person in the fall. Hopefully, fingers crossed, that's the plan for now. At the library in the Costin Room, and we'll also include a live stream to YouTube for those of you who prefer a hybrid option. If you're familiar with our Sunday classical concerts, the setup will be identical. And then we'll be sure to follow up with you closer to the date with more information. We look forward to seeing you there.
Okay. Bye, everyone.